Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you're enjoying a restful weekend. Today's episode is quite a big one, but I'm quite excited about it actually. This is one of my favourite ones from the last few weeks. It is the weekend, so it's a foreign policy, geopolitics, ideology heavy episode. And first up, we start in the South China Sea. Earlier in the week, in what may be a positive sign that the PRC and the Philippines are working to cool tensions over access to the second Thomas Shoal, US-based Associated Press reports that Beijing and Manila have set up, quote, a direct line of communication between the presidential offices of China and the Philippines to help prevent any new confrontation from spiraling out of control in the disputed South China Sea. End quote. China and the Philippines have created such emergency telephone hotlines at lower levels in the past to better manage disputes, particularly in two fiercely disputed shoals, where the Philippines has accused China of increasing hostile actions, and China says Philippine ships have encroached despite repeated warnings. A Philippine Navy officer confirmed too there has not been another attempt to resupply the Sierra Madre at Second Thomas Shoal since the violent June 17th incident. This week, too, U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Air Force General C.Q. Brown Jr., visited the Philippines to participate in a series of engagements alongside Philippines Armed Forces Chief of Staff, General Romeo Brawner Jr., to, quote, build upon U.S. investments and partnerships throughout the Indo-Pacific, end quote, and support the, quote, long-standing U.S.-Filipino defense relationship, end quote, according to a Department of Defense statement. Much of the Chinese state media coverage of the South China Sea tensions with the Philippines has been, unsurprisingly, quite blunt and entirely one-sided. However, among the intelligentsia in China, some voices have articulated a more nuanced Chinese foreign policy position in relation to the dispute. The folks at Sinification have published an excellent translation and analysis of one such voice this week. Zheng Yongnian is a political scientist who spent most of his career abroad and has now become one of China's most prominent public intellectuals. He recently gave a speech on the regional conflict and China's interests in it. Zheng's main message in the speech, Sinification writes, is to stress the importance of Southeast Asia's neutrality in the context of the US's rivalry with China. Beijing should strive to strengthen its ties with ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, countries, he says, as China's geopolitical security and future economic development depend on this. Zheng does not address China's complicated relations with the Philippines and Vietnam, though he suggests that Beijing might consider re-evaluating its approach to territorial disputes in the South China Sea, however unlikely that may be. Sinification then lists the 10 points in Zheng's speech. And remember, this is a prominent Chinese nationalist intellectual. His language will reflect this. We examine his comments to get an idea of the elite worldview in Beijing, including potential ideological blind spots. But also his comments on Russia are especially thought-provoking. We now quote the points directly. 1. A Trump victory in the upcoming US election could mean the return of fascism in the West and lead to even more aggressive policies towards China. 2. The rise of populism and nationalism across the world increases the risk of war. No one likes war, but war eventually happens. 3. A second Biden administration would help contain the rise of extremism, but US policy towards China would not change. 4. The world has not yet split into two opposing blocs, yet the likelihood of this happening is growing. 5. The West is intensifying its cognitive warfare against Beijing. This is having an impact on China's relations with other countries. 6. Japan and South Korea have already been brought into the US fold. 7. China-Central Asia ties continue to be dominated by security concerns. 8. India's rise constrains Beijing's ability to expand its geopolitical reach into New Delhi's sphere of influence. 9. Russia is a Western country that has long yearned to be accepted by the West. In fact, the relationship between Russia and the West is not as antagonistic as we perceive it to be. When the West rejects Russia, Russia opposes the West. When the West accepts it, Russia couldn't be happier. From the Soviet Union's Gorbachev to Russia's Yeltsin to the early years of President Putin, they have all been very pro-Western. Beijing must remain highly vigilant against any changes in Russia's stance towards the West, especially if a solution to the war in Ukraine is found. 10. For these reasons, strengthening ties with Asian countries should be central to Chinese foreign policy. China's security and economic development depend on it. The piece is both highly provocative and thought-provoking, and provides a fascinating peek into elite intellectual discourse in Beijing, warts and all. Let me know in the comments whether you would like a longer exploration of Zhang's speech in a future video. Now, with these comments on Russia in mind, let's now move to part 2, which is on Russia, China, and US geopolitical considerations. Earlier this week, Chinese and Russian fleets conducted 3-day maritime exercises from a naval port in Zhanjiang in South China's Guangdong province. According to state media, as a key part of the ongoing China-Russia joint exercise, quote, the drill included subjects such as anchorage defense, joint reconnaissance and early warning, joint search and rescue, and joint air defense and missile defense, end quote. Meanwhile, this week, the militaries of China and Belarus are taking part in an 11-day joint training exercise in the city of Brest, just 5 kilometers, 3 miles from the Polish border, and 28 kilometers, 17 miles from Ukraine. Minsk says these are part of their Eagle Assault anti-terrorism program. Belarus, China's closest ally in its invasion of Ukraine, also maintains close ties with Beijing, having been recently welcomed into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The exercise, which is the first time Chinese troops have been to Belarus for training, started on Monday last week and ended on Friday, yesterday. An unnamed Polish official speaking to Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post expressed, quote, we are pushing China to put pressure on Belarus, but apparently they didn't understand our request and sent the PLA to Minsk instead, end quote. The outlet added that while the exercises with the PLA pose no immediate threat to Poland or any other country, quote, the symbolism is clear. China is bolstering military ties with Europe's enemies and is increasingly seen as a security threat across the continent, end quote. As part of the exercises, Chinese and Belarusian troops simulated the capture of an airport days after NATO denounced Beijing as a decisive enabler of Russia's war effort. The joint air-ground combat exercise simulated an operation to seize control of an airport from terrorists using drones, paratroopers, and ground forces. China has called for direct peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in recent weeks, but Beijing has never condemned the invasion, insisting that it's part of Russia's legitimate security concerns, and has deepened its ties with Moscow since the start of the war. Indeed, this is accelerating the creation of two opposing blocs, the Chinese-led bloc and the US-led bloc. Indeed, on Friday, yesterday, senior US officials warned that Beijing was going in the, quote, wrong direction, end quote, by supplying material aid to Moscow for its Ukraine war efforts, and would likely face more sanctions soon if it did not reconsider its membership on, quote, Team Russia, end quote. Speaking at the Aspen Security Forum in the US state of Colorado, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed, quote, we have been prepared to tighten the screws to apply sanctions against specific entities and individuals, including in China. You can expect to see additional sanctions measures as we watch this picture continue to evolve in the coming weeks, end quote. He added, quote, writ large, the picture is not pretty. China continues to be a major supplier of dual-use items to Russia's war machine. It's the instruments that go into the weapons that are killing Ukrainians and oppressing Ukraine. And we think China should stop because we think it is profoundly outside the bounds of decent conduct by nation-states, end quote. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also spoke at the event, telling the audience, quote, China can't have it both ways. It can't all at once be saying that it's for peace in Ukraine when it is helping to fuel the ongoing pursuit of the war by Russia, end quote. He also explained how Chinese moves in East Asia were relevant to NATO concerns. Quote, European and other geographically distant allies increasingly recognize that any assertive Chinese moves involving Taiwan or the South China Sea would jeopardize 50% of the world's commercial cargo, And given that 70% of its semiconductors passed through the region, war over Taiwan, war across the Taiwan Strait, would be absolutely calamitous for the world, for Taiwan, for China, for the United States, for everyone. I've worried about it, and I believe that it has to be a fundamental objective of American policy to ensure that never happens." End quote. Harvard professor and former senior U.S. defense official who coined the term soft power, Joseph Nye, echoed the idea that challenges previously viewed as regional are increasingly global. Quote, "You can't talk about Ukraine without thinking about how it affects Taiwan. You can't talk about NATO without thinking about NATO not just as a European problem, but also how it relates to China." End quote. Next up, the idea of China. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, if you can hit the like button, this is a tremendous help. Sharing and subscribing is also a big help. It's the only way in which the channel can grow. So if you'd like to see this channel be shown to new people, liking, sharing, and subscribing is tremendously useful. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below. And there is also a link to follow the channel on Twitter or X. If something ever happened to the YouTube account, if it was lost or if it went down or if something happened, if it was blocked, I would be communicating and continuing new episodes on Twitter as an alternative, so that's also useful to follow if you're on the platform. That link is in the description too. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. This week, the European Council on Foreign Relations published a free ebook called The Idea of China, Chinese Thinkers on Power, Progress and People. The book is based on more than 100 on and off the record interviews with Chinese thinkers and tries to present to a Western audience the discourse and thinking within Beijing. The book argues that major debates are taking place about demography, feminism, and how to spread the word about China's success on the global stage. The book isn't particularly long, and it's a free download. I read it over the last couple of days. It is not a bad read. To end today's video, we will examine the executive summary of the book, which we are now quoting directly. 1. If the last few decades have seen the world changed by the spread of Chinese products and capital, the coming years could be strongly influenced by Chinese ideas. 2. While the Chinese government spent much of the past catching up to the West, its priority under Xi Jinping is to develop distinctively Chinese approaches to the questions of the age. 3. Although China has a heavily controlled public space, where the political leadership clearly lays out the contours that intellectuals operate within, scores of surprising and challenging ideas are developed and debated in the leading universities, think tanks, and party bodies. 4. Many thinkers and the Chinese leadership believe the US-led global order is crumbling, and the world experiencing a period of prolonged instability as a result. They propose ways for Beijing to survive the turmoil and shape the world in its own interests. 5. On questions such as AI, the green transition, and the international financial system, the spirit of the times is about writing a new playbook. Chinese thinkers are willing to reject rules that do not serve their intellectual goals. 6. Major debates are taking place in China about demography and identity. The CCP is anxious to deal with demographic headwinds, respond to feminism, and spread the word about China's successes on the world stage. Meanwhile, Chinese people are living in an increasingly repressive state, trying to develop their own agency and exploring new rights and identities, rather than simply doing the authorities' bidding. 7. China under Xi is not the country many Western leaders grew up with. It is determinedly carving out its own place in the world. The ideas generated by China could be its next major export, with serious consequences for Europe, prospects for prosperity, and universally agreed upon norms. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a great Saturday, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.